Hi, everyone.
Hello.
We're in the Pure Worship publication of the Watchtower. Chapter 9, I will give them a unified heart. And we mentioned they're not talking about Israel, they're talking about themselves.
As usual.
In that title. Yeah. So we're at the subheading on page 96. They will go into exile, into captivity. Here they are talking about Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just going to read two paragraphs. Through Ezekiel, Jehovah communicated clearly to his people how he would punish them for their rebellious course. They will go into exile, into captivity, Jehovah said, and they reference Ezekiel 12, verse 11. As we saw in chapter 6 of this publication, Ezekiel even acted out that sentence. But his was not the first such warning. Since the days of Moses, nearly a millennium earlier, Jehovah had warned his people that if they persisted in a rebellious course, they would suffer exile. Such prophets as Isaiah and Jeremiah had given similar warnings, and they reference Deuteronomy 28, verses 36 and 37, Isaiah 39, 5-7, and Jeremiah 20, 3-6. Sadly, though, those warnings largely fell on deaf ears. In time, Jehovah came to feel broken-hearted over his people's rebellion, their idolatry, their unfaithfulness, and I thought that didn't sound right, and their corruption under the influence of bad shepherds. He thus allowed them to suffer famine, which was a disaster and a disgrace, considering that their land had been one flowing with milk and honey. And they reference Ezekiel 20, verses 6 and 7. Then, as he had long foretold, Jehovah allowed his wayward people to be punished with exile. In 607 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon struck the final blow, destroying Jerusalem and her temple. Many thousands of the surviving Jews were carried off into exile in Babylon. There they suffered the mockery and opposition described at the outset of this chapter.
Well, what's wrong with that? Well, there's really nothing wrong with their analysis of how Israel got into this mess. The only obvious mistake is, as usual, you're being insistent, dogmatically insistent that it's all happened
in 607.
607. So that's wrong, just plain wrong. But it doesn't stop you from being so dogmatic about it. But everything else there looks like a pretty sane analysis of how they got into this mess.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing I would never have asked myself when I was a witness is, why is the punishment for them ignoring the law of God, the only nation that had the law of God, why is the punishment exile?
And not wiping them out.
So why would it be exile and not extermination?
Mm-hmm.
Because I did know as a witness that other nations, and the Watchtower even tells you about this, like Edom, Moab, Ammon, Nineveh, Assyria, Babylon, had been either completely exterminated or absorbed into other bloodstreams. That is, their national identity was gone. And yet you say the punishment for Israel, who are just like everybody else in being sinners, but have the additional accountability of the law of Moses, which they have now had for 800 years.
Mm-hmm.
Why are they just in exile and being brought back from exile after 70 years?
I think it's curious that they say that Deuteronomy 28 is a warning. So they don't see the prophetic aspect of Deuteronomy 28, where it describes exactly what's going to happen to them and how they're going to behave. So, if you don't see that as prophecy, but you do see a question in the New Testament as prophecy, and lots of other things. They are constantly making things that aren't prophecy, and things that are prophetic, not prophetic.
Yes, that's an interesting irony.
But in Deuteronomy 28, in that description of them, if you say that it is prophetic, if you say that it's prophetic, then God knew, and since it describes exactly what they were going to go through, he knew, and he chose. I'm going to give allowance for the way they think. The Watchtower says God can choose to know the future. So he knew, and yet he still goes with them? Like, why?
For 800 more years.
Yeah. If he knows they're going to be rebellious, they're going to, be unfaithful, why does he still continue with them, not start with a new people?
And as we're going to see in the next few paragraphs, next video, they're leaping from the exile, that is the 70-year period, which wasn't from 607, was probably from the beginning of the Babylonian dynasty. They're leaping from that right to the New Testament period and beyond.
After this, yeah.
Missing entirely that not only is Deuteronomy, as well as Leviticus 26, and all the prophets predict the first exile, but they also predict the second exile.
Yeah.
And a final regathering, as we pointed out in the previous videos on Ezekiel. So God knows all of this in advance,
and
but he knows
around.
something you don't know, which is that the very fact that they're in exile to this day is a testimony that God treats them differently than everyone else. And you think, well, that's not fair. Well, who said the universe is fair? The point is, God made promises to the forefathers which have nothing to do with the obedience of this or that generation, or even many generations of their descendants.
You're also forgetting, when you're a witness, that during that exile, they actually are cured of their idolatry.
Yes, they were.
So you don't find them being guilty of that.
Yeah, that's right. So the first exile had the desired result of curing them of this habitual idolatry that you complain about, and Deuteronomy and Leviticus complain about.
Yeah.
And that's still true, by the way. Here we are now 2,600 years ago, and Israel has never lapsed into that. That's not to say they're believers, though.
Yeah, they have their faults.
They have their faults.
But that's not one of them anymore. Idolatry is not, which was a reoccurring sin.
And what you missed here, and don't they also cite Ezekiel 20?
Verses
we just
6
dealt
and
with
7.
that. And what's in Ezekiel 20? We'll put in a link to that at the end, which is Ezekiel 20 plainly says that this rebellion, as it's put here, did not start with the law of Moses. It's not rebelling against revealed law, God's law, God's light. They've had this problem since way before Moses. And, so we could extend this 800 or 1,000 years back. Now 1,400 years they've had this problem since before they were called into the Promised Land.
And they should read all of 20, because it doesn't end with that. It doesn't end with
their problem.
You're finished.
That's right.
No, it ends with one day you're going to be
cured permanently.
Yeah.
And what's going to accomplish that? Well, we said something about that in the last video. But neither is Deuteronomy ending in the 30s. The verses they cite are in the 30s, right?
Yeah, they cite verses 36 and 37.
But the book of Deuteronomy has this enormous chapter in it, 68 verses, and the one in Leviticus 26 is just about as long.
You should read both of them.
Read both. That's our advice. Read Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, and you'll have no doubt what the punishment is. And then you might have to wonder, as we did, why only exile and not extermination? Well, here's a sample of what the chapter ends with. This is Deuteronomy 28, verses 64 to 66. And the Lord, that's Yahweh, will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. That's not contradicting what we just said about them being cured. The ones that went to Babylon were cured. They were the faithful remnant, actually, most of them. But the ones who were cast off, the 10 tribes before, were absorbed, as far as we can tell, into the nations, but not the Judeans, who we now call Jews. And verse 65 says, And among these nations you shall find no respite, and there shall be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But Yahweh will give you there a trembling heart and failing eyes and a languishing soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. Night and day you shall be in dread and have no assurance of your life. So the future of most Israelites would not be execution when they went at the time of the exile. It would be life among the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And that would be characterized by not just exile, but fear in exile. So
Yeah.
that, by the way, explains why Jews are always so consumed with wealth, because that's the only security they have. They don't have land.
Fear. Yeah, that they'll be vulnerable again.
Yeah.
But I think it's also in contrast with other nations that the Old Testament talks about that disappeared. They just disappeared. So when God wants to, he does that. He judges them and they disappear. But Israel is still around.
This is the point that got me thinking as a Jehovah's Witness pioneer and elder, that I can't explain this by the logic of Jehovah's Witnesses theology.
Mm-hmm.
According to my logic, they are more blameworthy than Edom, Moab, Ammon, Nineveh, and all the pagan nations.
Yeah.
How come they're gone and the Jews are still around? It doesn't seem just.
Yeah.
And it is not just, because by the logic
It's
of a
grace.
Jehovah's Witness, you should be completely gone.
Yeah. But it's the grace is not just found in the New Testament, it's found in the Old Testament. And Israel is an example of God's grace.
So it's there in the Torah.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, when you read Leviticus 26, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Read to the end, because the end there is also, I'm not going to abandon you. Tells all the bad things, and then he says, but I will not leave you completely.
That's right. I will not abandon you. That's very clear in Leviticus. So check it out.
Mm-hmm.
Because those chapters, which are generally ignored, except when they need them, like here, a couple of verses.
Yeah, they only pick what they want to use.
Yeah, as usual.
Yeah. So we're going to link to the video we did about Ezekiel chapter 20. Verse 41 is the one that they reference. So we say, Ezekiel 20, verse 41, snatched out of context. Does Yahweh predict the gathering of JWs in the last days? And we'll put the beginning of the Ezekiel playlist again. Well, we'll put the playlist on so you can start again if you want.
Sure. See you next time.
Bye.